Progress slide. Okay. Hi, my name is Acacia. I am a fourth year PhD student at Michigan State University. I'm working with Emily Dolson, who was a PhD student in Charles Ofria's lab here in Beacon, and then is now a professor here at Michigan State. So she and I have been working together on a variety of different projects, but the one that I'm talking about today is a project that I'm really excited about, that I think is really fun, which is a data visualization project leveraging VR and the Oculus headset. So we've been using virtual reality headsets to visualize data in new and interesting ways. But so as sort of a heads up, this is a work in progress style talk. So this is not like a published or not a like polished conference style presentation. What I'm going to do is for about the first, I'm not sure how long it'll take, about 15 minutes, I think, talk about where we're coming from, the motivation behind the work, sort of the past work and what we've done so far. I'm going to briefly go over what we sort of hope to do in the future. And then for the rest of, for the next like 10 or 15 minutes, I would love to have sort of a discussion with people who are here about what you want to see come out of virtual reality or 3D data visualization or data interfacing, because I think this would be a really fun group of people to talk to about like, what do you need out of the technology that we have and are developing. So part one is going to be this data visualization in VR work that we've been working on as a preview, and part two is a brainstorm. But so to start it off with part one, I wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm interested in and sort of the angle that I'm coming at this from. So I am a student in the integrative biology department rather than computer science or one of those rather than computer science or one of those disciplines. And so what I'm interested in mostly is this idea of connectivity and complexity as it relates to biological systems. So how things are related to each other and how those relationships and connections create really interesting systems and networks that we can sort of look at and analyze. So for example, this could be something like a genetic network. So this is a sort of artistic rendering of a gene network where like different colors maybe represent different groups of molecules working together. And you can see that there's a lot of interaction. Or it can go all the way up to the ecosystem level where the interactions and complexities and connections that you're thinking about are, food webs or ecological networks like that. And even more so, what I'm really interested in is sort of the large amount of connections and layers that are between these two levels of highly connected networks. So what that is often referred to is this genotype phenotype map. So how do we get from the sort of encoding of an organism to what we actually see when we look at a system or population? Visually, this is sometimes, if you're really mathy, represented like this, where you have genotype space or sort of this potential area of values that genes can take on that map to a phenotype space, which is the potential values that a phenotype can take on. And then that phenotype space itself maps to some level of fitness. And that fitness is sort of what we think of as evolutionary success. Another way to look at it might be you have these different, again, layers. And as you sort of move up through the layers, you're getting more abstract from like the really specific genes that you have to this idea of a fitness topography or a fitness landscape. And it's this fitness landscape that is a really interesting metaphor that has been around for a long time, almost 100 years now, So this is, for example, Sewall Wright drew this sort of topological representation of what a fitness landscape might be like, where you would read this like you would read sort of a map of a mountain, where pluses are areas of high fitness or areas where the phenotype space is mapped to a great success for that population. We can also view this now in sort of a representation where we're looking sort of at this 3/4 view, and this creates the illusion that our brains see of three-dimensionality. And so you can imagine, the x-axis here might be the value of one gene, and the y-axis might be the value of another, and then the z-axis up and down here would be the fitness of that particular combination of genes. And so these representations are what we call fitness landscapes. And so that's a word that I'm going to be using a lot in the talk. And whenever I say fitness landscapes, just think of this sort of this topological representation of the success of an organism. So that is a very powerful and popular visual metaphor, right? But it can be misleading to think of them like that. There's a lot of people have a problem with the idea of fitness landscapes because they're such a compelling metaphor that as humans, we sort of extend that metaphor into thinking that it encapsulates all of the properties of real fitness spaces in this topological metaphor. And there's a lot of ways they can be misleading. They can be unintuitive to look at. There are a lot of known problems with projecting three-dimensional images onto two-dimensional space. You can lose axes of information, but one of the major ways that they can be misleading is just in the number, just in when we look at them, the dimensions that we're not seeing. So for example, if we look at this, first of all, it's not super clear what this is, but if I told you that you need to get from this circle on the left to this circle on the right, and you're not allowed to touch the black space, how would you do it? It doesn't seem like it would be possible to, right? You can't get from one to the other if you are limited to this plane without entering that black space somehow. What if I show you this? Now you're seeing that the image on the left is just a single slice of what is actually an MRI of a human head to toe. So the top is, when this GIF starts, it's the crown of the head and it moves down to the brain, and then you're in the trunk, and then the two images on the left are just someone's legs. So if you needed to travel from one to the other, you can go up through their stomach and back down again. I'm going to move on from this slide now because that GIF is very distracting. This is what we call extra-dimensional bypass. So here is sort of the representation you might see in a paper where you have this slice through the landscape. And if you were looking at this slice without the rest of the landscape, you would see this peak here, this downward area, and then another peak here. And you would think, how can I get from A to B without going down at any point? How can I get from A to B without going to an area that's worse for me? And you would think that you can't, except that if you look at the other dimensions, you can walk along this curve in the back that you don't see if you take a slice. And so that can be a big problem when we're thinking about looking at and trying to make, what's the word I'm looking for? Make inferences from even three-dimensional landscapes, because it's possible that there's some fourth-dimensional bypass that the population could take that we're not aware of because we're looking at it in 3 dimensions. And 3 dimensions is really sort of as far as we can stretch this right now, because as you can tell, right, what you're looking at here is a 2D representation of a 3D. Uh-oh, my Zoom has frozen, so I'm not sure if you guys can still hear me. Oh, good, back to normal. Okay, what we're looking at here is a 2D representation of 3 dimensions. So how would we even begin to look at a 2D representation of 4 dimensions? It would involve a lot of, we wouldn't be able to do it in a static image like this for sure. So what we want to be able to do is add dimensions to our visual models of fitness landscapes in order to start to build intuition. So obviously what this won't do, even if we can add a third dimension, is give us access to the fifth dimension or sixth or nth dimension. But what it can do is sort of expand that fitness landscape metaphor a little bit further and get us to start thinking more abstractly and more intuitively about some small problems that we can visualize in 3 dimensions. And so the way that we're doing this is through virtual reality headsets. And so I don't have mine on me, and a lot of you probably don't have them. I didn't buy mine. The wonderful Dolson Lab bought mine for me, so they are not quite at a price point where everybody's going to have one lying around. However, there are a lot of great web tools that we can use. So what we've been doing is developing, I wanted to make sure I didn't have another slide. What we've been doing is developing web-enabled VR so that you can go to a website and cast it to your Oculus or cast it to some places have these phone things where you can put your phone in a headset and it'll sort of stereo project the images for you. And what that does is it allows your brain to imagine that you are in this 3D space, and that lets us have 3 axes to work with when it comes to genotype, and then we can assign a 4th dimension, like in our case color, to fitness, and that adds just 1 more dimension. So to show you a little bit more about what this looks like, I'm first going to show you what this looks like when you have 2 of the dimensions as genotype space, and the 3rd dimension is still fitness, but instead of having it projected in this sort of 3/4 view, you have it in actual VR. So this is Emily's work from, I popped it out of the frame. So this is Emily's work from a few years ago now. And what you're seeing here is a landscape where you have one axis is one gene. It's really one sort of number in a tuple or a coordinate pair, and the other is the other one. And then the height is fitness. The color and the height are a direct map to each other. It just helps your brain to interpret what they look like. And what's nice about this visualization that gives you something different from what you might be able to see just in a still image is, for example, if we look at this function, if you look at it from this sort of 3/4 view, you can get the intuition that there are these spikes, but what you don't see is if you look underneath, there's all of these really deep valleys as well. And so that's just one example of something that you can see in VR and in a space where you're actually walking around in what your brain can perceive as a 3-dimensional space that you can't get from just looking at an image. You might be able to look at multiple angles of the same image, but being able to see it in 3D space really helps you build some more of that intuition. There's also some other really nice things here. You can draw sort of paths of evolution along this, which at this high of a mutation rate is pretty messy. But if we take it down a little bit, might be better, except that, oh, look, they've just all bunched up right there. So we have this nice visualization where we can walk around in it and see. But again, here, the 3rd dimension here is still fitness. And so if we want to expand this into really a 4-dimensional visualization, what we need to do is have each point in 3D space represent a genotype, and then some quality of that point has to be the fitness. And so that's what we've done here. This is going to be that same function here. So this is the Schubert function. This is what that function looks like expanded into its 3D form when it loads. So now we are inside a huge space, and in your web browser, it's a little bit overwhelming because you don't get that depth that you do in a VR headset. But if you're curious and you have a VR headset and you go to this website, you can click this and it'll show it accurately. But each point here represents a point in the fitness space. So this is for example, we're standing at 0, 0, 0. Over there is, 0, 0.1. And the color of each sphere represents fitness, where very bright colors like these very, very bright yellows are peaks, and these very deep blues are valleys, in much the same way here that these very bright areas are peaks and these really deep areas are valleys. Mike asked if I could make this available. Yes, so this demo is on the web right now. So if I send this link in the chat, you can see it if you would like and look around. And so right now, something that we have noticed from this representation that you wouldn't get looking at sort of a list of these values is you can get the sense of landscape ruggedness. So you can see this is a pretty rugged landscape, and by rugged, I mean there's a lot of very quick changes in fitness because you see these really bright colors next to these really deep colors. For some contrast as to what a smooth landscape might look like, we can try out this one, where your brain sees this really smooth color palette and transition from one color to the next. There's not as many peaks or sharp points here. So this is basically, if I put them side by side again, so this is the two-dimensional landscape with the third dimension is fitness, and this is a three-dimensional landscape with the fourth dimension is fitness, and that's the difference. So that is what we've come up with so far. There are a couple of things about this representation that are a little bit tricky and that I would love if other people have experience developing anything in VR, whether it be games or know something about that. One of the things is we want to, here, let me go back to my slides because I have a list of stuff. But let me, so one of the things we want to do immediately in the future, of course, is add lineages, the way that in the first one you could see the evolutionary path along the landscape. We also want to reduce visual overload. We're thinking of a multitude of ways to do that, whether it's only showing points that are very close to you or only showing points that are close to that lineage. Also, we need to figure out how to implement vertical movement, which is not something that VR often wants you to be able to do. I think to avoid people getting really motion sick, because it turns out that moving around in VR is very motion sickness inducing for a lot of people, and then add a nice HUD to it. And then I also would love to hear your thoughts as to what you think would be fun if you were walking around a 3D landscape. So I'm going to pause there, and I'm happy to talk about or answer questions about that before going on to like a big brainstorming session. Mike says you also might not want to implement vertical movement because people would injure themselves, which is a really great point.
I've got a question kind of in general about VR.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, so for text on the web, there's assistive technology like text to speech. For images, there's stuff like alt text. Have people been talking about, or I can't even imagine how it would be possible to have some kind of an assistive technology for VR.
That is it's very funny that you asked that question. So the project that we are wanting to do next after this project, and actually over the summer, is a data sonification project. So instead of a visual representation of this landscape, we want to make an audio representation that conveys the same sort of properties that the visual one does, but allows it to take advantage of the sound capabilities of the VR headset and give you like directional sound so that you can move around in that space.
That's really neat. So you would interact with it like a 3D space, and you would like your movement would correspond to changing what you hear.
Mm-hmm. That's the idea, and I'm really hoping that we can figure it out. But yeah, it's definitely something that I think is cool.
Yeah, thank you.
On that same note, actually, something I was curious about is there are a number of great sites out there for us to see what images look like to people with various color vision issues. Mm-hmm. Is there anything we can do to easily see what these images would look like to people who have issues with stereoscopic vision or parabolic hearing if you're doing a sonification?
So for stereoscopic vision, it'll pretty much look like this. So this is like a flat representation of this landscape because the computer screen doesn't have that depth effect that a VR headset or even like a phone that is set up for VR is, where it shows your eyes two different images. So this is sort of what it would look like if someone were, for example, blind in one eye or had some other issue with depth perception. For single ear vision or single ear hearing, I'm not sure what that might look like, but I imagine in a similar way you could plug it into like a single speaker and see what comes out of it. But yeah, this does look different and more a lot more depthy in VR in a way that's like hard to describe unless you see it. But there's also some graphics issues with it that are not yet resolved. So if you plug this in and get really nauseous, don't don't sue me.
Thank you for your talk. That was really interesting. My first question that came to mind is how difficult would it be to add in an implementation where you could modify the parameters that generate the initial landscape and then view it as it changes, you know, so you could see if I don't know, it had a higher mutation factor or something. How does that change the ruggedness and so on? So
that was my question for you all. What would you do with the data given an extra dimension? We are still actively developing this project. I am presenting sort of a 15-minute version of this project at the very beginning of January at a biology focused conference. But after that, we are hoping to take it to the Gecko visualization workshop. And so having sort of the Beacon community's ideas of what you want to see in it is really helpful for sort of shaping what we do between now and then. So this is my like note slide of smart things that smart people say in this question and answer session. So I'm going to write changing parameters and watching it change. Yeah, that would be really cool. That's definitely something that so Emily's landscape, when you change it, you have to hit draw and it like redraws it for you. I imagine that is a graphics limitation, but Emily, if you want to say a little bit more about like why you made that choice.
I'm trying to remember, gosh, this was a while ago. I don't think it's necessarily a graphics limitation so much as that was a convenient interface because there were a lot of different things you might want to toggle. And it was useful to have control over when they drew because drawing is like a little bit computationally intensive and these VR headsets often don't have as much computational power as we're used to working with. Right. And if it draws partially, it can be really nausea inducing. So giving the user control over that was useful.
Yeah, one of the major things that I never thought about before working on this project was what kinds of visualizations are going to make my viewer throw up. So it is definitely a new challenge. Barry, I saw you raised your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry about the vacuum cleaner in the background, but
no worries.
Everybody should be used to that by now, I guess. I want to know what the Gecko visualization workshop is.
Oh.
If you throw a link in the chat, I'd sure love to check that out. But I really love what you're doing here. What's your development environment for creating it?
Sorry?
it Unity, or like, how are you making this?
Oh, yeah. What's the like software?
Yeah.
So we are using a combination of tools. Mostly what we're using is D3, the JavaScript sort of
Oh, really?
data thing hooked into A-frame,
Huh?
which is like a web-based VR framework.
Oh,
Yeah, and
Yeah.
then when we look at it in the Oculus, we use the Firefox virtual app or whatever it's called.
Web VR.
WebVR, and just view it at that URL that I sent in the chat.
I mean, because you're making a choice there, right? In terms of like access. I mean, and D3 has so many awesome things in it, but you're sort of favoring accessibility.
Yes.
Because I think the sort of more advanced and expensive and all of the equipment that school kids don't have and most people don't have, the nausea problems, a lot of the things you're struggling with they've pretty much solved those, haven't they? And so you're operating in a space where the technology is accessible but less powerful. I think.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, maybe
So,
you guys
as
could.
far as the nausea thing goes, it's something that like it's less of the technology itself and more of the implementation of the particular way that you view it. So there's a lot of like ways to solve the nausea problem. We just haven't decided which one to go with. So one of them is like just only allowing teleportation.
Yeah.
Another one is like giving your viewer like visual cues that they're moving beyond like the environment itself. Yeah, so we are favoring accessibility and web-enabled stuff a lot because we want people to be able to actually use it and see it.
No, that's
and also because in general the eCode lab, which is Emily's lab, and our close collaborators, the Devo lab, are often publishing our stuff to the web, and so we want everything to be sort of web talkable.
I have one last little thing, like in terms of how you would want your data visualized and things like this. I mean, I just love this kind of stuff, and I love what you are all doing. But like, to me, if you're in this kind of an environment, one of the like super big advantages is the potential dynamic representation. So I think you talked, I can't remember who mentioned it, about the parameters changing and you can watch things change, but just being able to either manipulate parameters so you can see a change in the fitness landscape, or have external factors or a model running or something like that, or they can even manipulate which what dimensional axes they actually want to visualize among a list of them. Like the interactive dynamic nature of this system, I think is really really cool.
I think that's a really cool feature of it, and definitely one of the things that sort of made me interested in this kind of work is like we're still sort of presenting a lot of our figures and a lot of our scientific data as if we're sort of sitting in our rooms hand drawing them on like little sheets of paper, but we have a lot more technology now that we can do a lot more stuff with.
Preach on. Thank you.
Mike
Super
and Cliff
cool.
both raised your hands, but I don't know who went first, so I'm gonna call on Cliff because his name's first.
So I have sort of a consulting question. Would it be possible to share my screen?
I think I don't know. I can try to give you.
I can make that happen, I think.
Yeah, I think that's Danielle's field.
All right, Cliff, you are now a co-host and you can share.
All right, awesome. So let's do that. All right, let's see if this comes up.
Cliff, are you trying to get me to make Cliff plots in VR?
Well, eventually, yeah, but.
Well, yeah.
Did that work? Am I sharing something that looks like? Okay, so this is showing some fitness and genotype over time data, and then I do some more work, and get the lineages in it.
Yeah.
And what this is a linear population where each step down in Y is the next generation. And so we can track lineage over time. The problem is that the system I really want to be working in has data that looks like this in 2D. And what I'd like to be able to do is project these same lineage lines through three-dimensional space. So the real question is, what is the data limitation? How many line segments or how would you model these transitions? Can you realistically have in your model data set and have the thing actually allow you to move around in the space?
We don't know. So there's two, there's sort of two constraints. One is like the landscape itself is a little bit hard to get very large because of the cubic nature of it. Like if you want to add like one more like tick in each direction, you get immediately like three more, or like, yeah. It's hard. The second thing is, I don't think drawing the lines themselves is going to be that computationally intensive, because if you look at sort of let me share my screen again. For example, like here, you can get like a lot of lines on here. Let's bump the mutation rate up and make like, you can get like a lot of lines on here and it doesn't really complain. The question is, one, how useful is that? But two, like, it's not really about the lines, it's about the landscape. Like the landscape here is still pretty simple. There's this nice like Z separation thing you can do where like you sort of bump them up above the plane a little bit, and you can like see them separated out, so you can sort of see them distinctly. And that's something that I don't know how we can translate to 3D. That was one of the things that we struggled with sort of coming up with this extension, is like, okay, how are we going to visualize multiple lineages at once? And the answer we came up with at the time was we're not. Which we haven't done yet, because D3 is really good at visualizing all kinds of data except lines. It's like the one thing that it can't. Like you can do it, but it's not as simple as everything else. And it got away from me faster than I expected it to. I will get back to you when I know the answer to that question.
You don't feel that if we did sort of a pruned sort of lineages where each generation is represented in Y and we just link them up, do you think that would be too noisy for, say, population sizes of 500 or 1,000?
I don't think it would be too noisy. I think it's more about the size of the landscape than it is about the number of lineages.
Well, I'm saying not even trying to map the lineages onto the landscape, just getting phylogeny trees.
Oh yeah, we could do that.
Okay.
For sure.
Then I have data sets.
Yay.
Awesome. We would love to try to visualize them.
Yeah. Mike.
So I want to preface this with the fact that I know that I am not a computer scientist and I have no idea if this is actually a reasonable thing.
Okay.
But one thing I would love for a data visualization is if I have something I've evolved, so I've got some sort of line of descent that I've been able to do some sort of mutational landscaping on. I would love to be able to visualize the current 1 and 2 step mutants from that and be able to choose a direction, walk to that mutant, and then view the landscape from that mutant's place in the landscape.
Okay. Yeah. So you're thinking of, yeah, I think I get what you're saying. I do think that's possible, and I think that's really cool. We should talk more about it.
Absolutely.
And then Rob, I think you had your hand up for a while.
Yes, very cool. So whenever I see these things, they always almost seem like they're kind of one-off where someone's displaying, that you can do it, which is always just fun in itself. But it seems like the next step, which you're really close to, is sort of the two, what I think of as two general kinds of usefulnesses of this, besides just as cool. And one of them is the idea of using it for discovery, okay, which is that you don't know what's in your data, but because you have this new way of visualizing it, it lets you play with it in the situation.
Yeah.
Twiddling the knobs. I mean, the only thing I've ever seen people do typically is turn them in space, which is sort of what you displayed, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes you see things there, right? You see the underneath, and that lets you discover something that you may not have noticed before. But it seems like there are other ways in which potentially
Yeah.
by having, while you're in the space, the ability to turn knobs, right, which then might let you discover something about it that you didn't notice. Just that ability seems like it could provide something useful. You might discover something. So that's one use case, which I've never really seen implemented. You always have to do this in advance, and then anyway. So that's one thing I would sort of suggest. It'd be cool to be able to do this in a way that would let the visualization allow you to potentially discover something that you might not have noticed. The other general use purpose for this is the display side, right? It's when something's already been discovered, and the idea is to show it to people, right? And this too is something I don't know why people haven't done it, at least I haven't seen it yet, which is that you don't even have any way easily to point at things, or to have something to say, you'll look over there, and it's sort of like you have an arrow that you can point to the point that's of interest, or even put on the axes and display the things that are of that have been displayed, but in a way that labels them, right? There, you always see the thing itself, but you don't see the label. So I'd love something that's a tool that lets you essentially put on display labels, pointers, axes, things of that sort, that essentially let you, once you've already discovered something, really highlight and show to someone else, hey, look over here, right? This is the thing.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think you're obviously ready to do, but that would be a useful thing for people for this. But anyway, very cool.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good point. Those things are definitely, so that's one of the advantages I think of us building this in D3 and an A-frame, is that there are ways to put sort of labels and pointers and things like that on sort of the objects in the space. I'm less sure about how easy it is to do that if you're not in the back end of things. So that's definitely something to look into. Risto, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so a general question, because what it seems to me what you've done is you've taken like the standard visualization, which is in 2D landscape, and now with the VR you can add one more dimension to it, and now you're moving in 3D. But a lot of times the challenge is really that there is not 1, 2, 3, there's 3, 5, 6, 20 different dimensions, and now you can't keep adding dimensions like this. So how could you deal with higher dimensional spaces, and what would the 3D visualization allow you to do in higher dimensional spaces?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's one that I've been thinking about a lot as we're like building this project, is like, okay, so we can add one more dimension, but a lot of the times we want a lot more than that. There's a few different ideas. So obviously you can't just keep adding dimensions infinitely, but there are a lot of really cool, not a lot, but there are a few really cool ways people have come up to visualize like the fourth dimension in VR, other than just with color. So that's something that I'd be interested in looking into, as to how people can sort of like start moving through that space. Another option is like somebody suggested, I think maybe Barry, is like allowing people to choose which of a large set of dimensions they want to visualize at one time, which can also be misleading. You can miss things, it can be less intuitive, but it can be really interesting in sort of the same way that you can take a lot of dimensions and look at like a principal components analysis of 2 dimensions. You could do an analogous thing in 3D and look at that, or just choose specific dimensions to look at. So that's a place it could go.
Yeah, you could also maybe do a PCA or Disney or something on a subset of dimensions and do it a couple of times so that you have only 4 dimensions to deal with, or three basically. So you group them, do the dimensional reduction, and then move in that space. Now, Daniel, can I have the screen a little bit? Because I have another idea that I'd like to propose, if that's not a, yeah, so, okay, let's see.
There you go.
Okay, I'm a co-host. Okay, cool. Let me see.
Sorry,
Where is that?
I live on a one-way street, and I just saw someone driving backwards down the entire street, which I think is in this letter of the law, but perhaps not the spirit. Anyway, yes.
Oh yeah, okay. All right. So so this is something that Erikin Bajechi developed in the early days of Beacon, 2012. And he was looking at NK landscape, which are, like in this case, 20-dimensional binary spaces. And we had a real hard time understanding what that space was like. So he came up with this idea that you could take the perspective of one point, this one here, and then line up all of its neighbors, 20 different rays, because it's 20-dimensional landscape, actually. So each dimension is a different direction and a sphere around it. And then from each of those, you could have a couple of more rays and a couple of more rays. You can't represent all the points, but you represent the nearby points exactly, and the next a little bit more fuzzily. But I think it has some interesting connections of what you showed us, because there's this perspective. You're standing on the origin, like you said. Well, you're standing on this point, and then you see these points disappear into the distance. You see that here too, and it might be possible to actually use this as a way of reducing the 20 dimensions into 3, and then use your mechanism to explore that. And we were always thinking, like, is this intuitive? It's kind of has the 3D structure in it, so it seems like intuitively you could understand it. So it'd be really interesting to see if we could do something with this kind of a dimensional reduction with the tool that you have.
Yeah, can you send that? It looks like there's a URL there. Can you send it in the
Oh
chat?
yeah, I can send it to you. Yeah,
Awesome.
It does actually code also, and we haven't run it for a couple of years, but you know, if you think, take a look. If you think it's interesting, we can talk.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Well, that's all I've got for you. And I really appreciate all the feedback. There's a lot of good ideas, and I'm excited to hopefully show you guys this kind of stuff again when I've implemented some of these, and see if it's helpful for you in the kind of data that you're interested in.
It was very interesting. Thank you so much for sharing. One of the supervisors at my PhD Viva 2 years ago was Gabriella Ochoa, who obviously quite big into fitness landscapes and everything. So it's interesting to see the evolution of how things are progressing from back then to now being in VR, which is cool.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Is there any plans to use like a tactile glove that you can sort of touch the fitness landscape?
So I think like a year or two ago, they completely overhauled how the Oculus Touch controls even work. So once we figure out how to even like use the current Oculus Touch controls, then maybe we could talk about that. There's been a lot of the parts of this project that I expected to be difficult to implement were like this, and the parts that I thought would be like, oh, we'll just implement touch controls. That must be something that people do all the time. There must be a template for it. No. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much. This was a really interesting topic and a great discussion.
Yeah.
So let's all thank Acacia one more time. Great job.
Thank you. Everybody have a wonderful Thanksgiving. If you're in the US, if you're not, have a wonderful week.
Thanks, everyone. See you next time.
Is it possible to get a transcript of the chat?
Yes, it is.